1908, Leonora Lang dedicated her book of Princes and Princesses to 8-year-old Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. The last story ends, amidst the welcoming shouts of the English people, Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen. 30 years later, that's exactly what happened. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was born on August the 4th, 1900. Her father, Lord Strathmore, didn't get round to registering the birth on time and was fined 7 shillings and 6pence.
So often she tells one things that, you know, nobody else is ever going to remember. Her father, my grandfather, I mean, in his day in London, no gentleman could possibly be seen carrying a parcel. That was absolutely not done. You had to have somebody else to carry your parcel. And she said he used to go off to Tattersall's every morning. I think it was a sort of men's clubby kind of place.
Lord Strathmore was a fanatical cricketer who had been known to bowl Christmas puddings down the dining table to his wife. He was descended from the Scottish King Robert the Bruce and was a firm believer in the superiority of the Scottish aristocracy. He'd often come across King Edward VII and thought him too stout. "If there's one thing I've determined for my children," he said, "it's that they shall never have any sort of post about the court." The Strathmores had their headquarters at Glamis Castle. They were landowners with substantial coal mining interests, 65,000 acres of land, and 4 grand houses around Britain.
I asked her about childhood in Scotland, and she said, "Well, you know, this business about my being quite so Scotch," she said, "little played up, you know. In my childhood, we children simply followed the birds." Couldn't quite think what she meant, and then, of course, the penny dropped. The houses were chosen as to where the shooting was.
She said we were always on the move. My recollection is my poor mother was always worrying about, you know, the staff in the next house. They had Glamis, and they had a beautiful house called Streatham in County Durham. Beautiful Charles II house, which at last has been pulled down, and which she deeply regrets, said my father ought never to have sold it.
In Hertfordshire they had St Paul's Waldenbury, which the younger children always thought of as home. Elizabeth's 14th birthday treat was a visit to the music hall. On the bill were Rinaldo the Wandering Violinist and Lipinski's Dog Comedians. That same evening, August the 4th, 1914, war was declared. Abruptly, childhood was over. In the first few weeks, 500,000 young men joined the army. Among them were 4 of the Bowes Lyon brothers. Within days, the Strathmores had converted Glamis Castle into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers.
When the war started, she was sent up here and completed her education with a governess here, but helped to look after all the soldiers and did a tremendous amount. And in fact, I think towards the end of the war, when her mother wasn't well, I think she pretty well ran the whole of Glamis.
But being secluded in Scotland was no protection from the horror of war. Michael Bowes Lyon was reported missing, Patrick was severely shell-shocked, Fergus snatched a few hours' leave to see his new baby daughter, and 3 days later was killed at the Battle of Loos. On Armistice Day, Queen Mary wrote in her diary, "Dull first, rain in the afternoon, the greatest day in the world's history, a day full of emotion and thankfulness, tinged with regret at the many lives who have fallen in this ghastly war."
My great-grandmother wrote every week to her daughter. Elizabeth Lyon is out now, And Cecilia has had a dance for her. How many hearts Elizabeth will break.
Of course, it was a very chaperoned life in those days. And I remember her saying once that she'd managed to sneak down the stairs and out of the door before everybody realised, in order to go and have lunch with somebody who she liked at the time. I imagine a gentleman. And it was a very exciting adventure to get out of the house without anybody knowing and having a sort of secret lunchtime rendezvous.
The boys buzzed around Elizabeth and her gang of girlfriends, the Mad Hatters. The one she liked best was James Stewart. He was a debonair war hero, but he had a reputation as a philanderer.
I think everybody wanted to marry her. I mean, she's quite discreet but funny about it.
She's got a charming face, of course. Even in repose, she has got a sort of round face. Even in repose, she's sort of half got a smile on her face. But it's a face that can look sad with beauty and happy with beauty, and it's wonderful. The Queen has got a square face, which means that the Queen can look cross sometimes if she's... But Queen Elizabeth never looks cross, because she's got a round face. At least that's my theory.
One of her most determined suitors was James Stuart's boss, the Duke of York, King George V's second son. Prince Albert, known to his family as Bertie, became a regular visitor to St Paul's, Waldenbury.
He came quite a lot. He came shooting. My dad used to say, "Oh, that's the Duke of York. And there's Lady Elizabeth." And we thought, oh, goody, you know. It was like romance to me, you see, because he was a royal prince, good-looking, dressed in grey, mostly.
A young man called Prince Albert. For him, life was a constant round of public duties, faithfully performed. As second son, Prince Albert might have passed his time pleasantly in the sports and luxuries of the well-to-do, but that was not his way.
Both their families thought Elizabeth would be a suitable match for Bertie, but the first time he proposed, through an intermediary, she turned him down. So the mothers conspired to clear the way for Bertie by dispatching James to the oil fields of Oklahoma.
I think she took some time to make up her mind. If somebody does have a lot of admirers, you have to eventually make up your mind who you like best. She realized the implications, not what happened in the future, but how it would change her life up to a point.
It was a Sunday. They didn't turn up to church. They went for this walk. We think that he proposed to her there. He was such a lovely person, and she was so lovely, and they seemed so happy. They seemed meant for each other. That's what I think, you see.
"I feel very happy but quite dazed," wrote Elizabeth to a girlfriend. "We hoped we were going to have a few days' peace first, but the cat is now completely out of the bag, and there's no possibility of stuffing him back."
She became engaged to the Duke of York. It was absolutely wonderful breath of fresh air in really slightly, perhaps sticky atmosphere. She was very fond of King George V. "Wasn't it lucky I was never frightened of him?" is all she's ever said. She made jokes and she made everything fun, and I think it was something that they'd never really known before.
I don't think it was an easy atmosphere. The convention at the time was a sort of Teutonic sternness, a sort of cold baths regime, not merely physically but emotionally. I don't think their greatest admirers would say they were good parents. I think they were very fond of their children, but I think it was a strain.
We were brought up very strictly. My father was a great disciplinarian, and in those days, as opposed to today, there was an old adage which said, children are to be seen and not heard. I don't believe that applies today. Sometimes when my father admonished me for something that I'd done, said, "My dear boy, you must always remember who you are." So I used to think, well, now who am I? No answer.
The newly formed BBC was refused permission to broadcast the service on the wireless on the grounds that it might be listened to by men in pubs wearing hats. The wedding was a source of satisfaction and relief to both families. "This is the one girl who could make Bertie happy," said Queen Mary. Bertie was only second in line to the throne, but unlike his playboy brother, the Prince of Wales, he now had a wife to help him with his exhausting round of official engagements.
The years following marriage were full of public service of the Duke and Duchess, on whom began to fall a portion of those engagements which were the lot of royalty. Crossing unostentatiously by Channel steamer to France, the Duke and Duchess of York journeyed to East Africa to visit the growing colony of Kenya.
The journey to Africa was particularly memorable. They were genuinely completely out of touch, and the country was hardly opened up. Extraordinary. And to have walked all the way from Nairobi to the Nile, out through Turkana, where people generally had never seen a white man, let alone a white lady. If one ever was slightly at a loss for a subject to talk to Queen Elizabeth about, one only had to mention Africa, and her eyes would mist over as she thought back to those days.
I've quite often been at Royal Lodge when she's shown some guest who was interested in Africa her old photograph book, which has got a lot of photographs. And I mean, she'll remember everything. She'll remember the name of the bearers, the man who carried the gun, the name of the man who brought her early morning tea. And she'll even remember, I had some Kenyan friends who went round there once, and she showed them the photographs. She even remembered how to ask for early morning tea in Swahili. They walked everywhere, and she shot quite a lot of, well, yes, that's nowadays of the climate, we don't talk about shooting animals. But I mean, it was tough. They got up really early and walked for 5 or 6 hours, you know, chasing a buck or something, you know. So I think the whole thing was wonderful, strange, exciting, and obviously, you know, newly married, it was sort of like a great adventure. And I think it stuck in her mind more than any other trip she's ever done.
"My darling Mamma," wrote Elizabeth to Queen Mary, "we've had the most wonderful time, and we've both enjoyed it so much that words fail me to describe our happiness. Of course, mentally, we have had a wonderful rest. One never worries about anything, and only lives for the moment, which is quite impossible in England. I feel it must be good for one, and certainly Bertie has become much calmer and not half so nervy." They were away for 4.5 months. In the newsreels, their return home took second billing to the cricket team that hadn't won the Ashes. Back home meant back to the round of official ceremonies, factories, prize givings and fetes. The Duchess of York attacked these potentially tedious occasions with verve and charm. She lightened the task for the Duke, who was shy with people he didn't know and stammered badly when he spoke in public. I remember thinking at the time, wrote Thelma Lady Furness, one of the Prince of Wales's married lady friends, that if I ever had to live in a bungalow in a small town, this is the woman I would most like to have as a next-door neighbour to gossip with while hanging out the washing in our backyards. But trouble was brewing in industrial Britain. Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day, ran the miners' slogan. We'll be slaves no longer. Unrest spread to every corner of the country. For the first time in its history, Britain risked being paralysed by an all-out strike. The strike began at midnight on the 3rd of May, 1926. I could hear the tumbrils rolling, wrote Lady Diana Cooper, and heads sneezing into baskets. A couple of weeks earlier, the Home Secretary had been called to the Yorks house in Bruton Street to attend the birth of their first child, Princess Elizabeth. He was there to make sure there was no surreptitious switching of the baby. This had been the custom ever since the days of James II and the warming pan plot. We always wanted a child to make our happiness complete, wrote the Duke to his mother. I do hope you and Papa are as delighted as we are. Or would you have soon had another grandson? I know Elizabeth wanted a daughter. But the Yorks' domestic idyll was under threat from within the family. The Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, was alarming the establishment with his open concern about unemployment and poverty, about the misery and squalor that troubled so many of his future subjects.
I really saw some terrible things when you look back.
And you didn't have, as it were, you didn't have political conceptions about how the country should
I had
be
lots
run.
of political conceptions, but I kept them to myself, because that is the tradition of the royal family.
In January 1927, the Duke and Duchess of York were sent on their first imperial mission, a tour of New Zealand and Australia. It meant leaving little Princess Elizabeth behind. The Duchess wrote to her mother-in-law, "The baby was so sweet playing with the buttons on Bertie's uniform that it quite broke me up." The King wrote back, "I am glad to be able to give you the most excellent accounts of your sweet little daughter, who is growing daily. She has 4 teeth now, which is quite good at 11 months old." The Duchess, wrote the Governor of South Australia, has had a tremendous ovation and leaves us with the responsibility of having an entire continent in love with her. The visit has done untold good. It's put back the clock of disunion and disloyalty 25 years. A well-known communist agitator was heard to say, "Why, they're human. Yesterday I was in the crowd with the wife, and I'm blessed if the Duchess didn't smile right into my face. I've done with his damned communism."
She's an extraordinary person. Everybody who's come in contact with her falls under the spell, in my view, and I've now known her for nearly 60 years. She's never changed. I think she should marry the head gamekeeper. She'd have run everything. She's just the same talking to the gardener or to the Prime Minister. I mean, she really doesn't alter herself at all.
They'd been away for nearly 6 months. In their luggage were 2 tons of toys for the baby princess, presents from the people of Australia and New Zealand.
We were at a dinner party. It was at number 10 Downing Street. The Queen Mother was sitting opposite me. I said, when you're raising children, what do you think the most important thing is that I could teach them? And Laurence Olivier, to my right, there was a frozen silence at the table, during which it jogged my memory that you're not supposed to ask queens questions. And Laurence Olivier said something like, "Ma'am, she means that." And the Queen Mother said, "I know what she means. I want to think for a moment." It was very decent of her, And then she said, beautifully, her face lit up, and she said, "I think it's manners." And I said, "Really, you think?" And she said, "Yes, I think manners will get you through anything."
I think she was very clever because she never, ever reprimanded them in public. She took more afterwards, but that was her technique, and consequently they always behaved very well.
In 1935, King George V celebrated his Silver Jubilee. The royal family's popularity had reached a new pinnacle of exuberance.
Has the Queen ever looked so beautiful? Certainly, I have never seen such a handsome figure of majesty as Queen Mary presents today. We watched and waited, and when the King and Queen passed, were our hearts too full for words? The example of the Royal House of Windsor must exercise a glorious influence upon the destiny of generations yet to come.
But the glorious ceremonial disguised the problems that were fermenting. The king was seriously ill, and the man who would succeed him was not playing the game by royal rules. The Prince of Wales had started to consort with an ambitious American woman, Wallis Simpson.
Here is a rare Pathé News picture of Edward and Wally leaning from their box, second from right. We repeat the picture so you can see Edward step back to give Wally a better view of the race.
Mrs. Simpson had been married twice, but divorced only once. The King and Queen were not enchanted at the prospect of the heir to the British throne being under the thumb of an American divorcee. The sunset of his death, wrote Queen Mary in her diary, tinged the whole world's sky.
On the third day, the mortal remains of our late king were taken from the church and borne through the Norfolk village for the journey to London. King Edward walked with his brothers, the Dukes of York and Gloucester. Her Majesty the Queen followed in a carriage with the Princess Royal and the Duchess of York, and later in the cortege came tenants and workers of the royal estate, and the king's favourite pony.
My eldest son will never succeed me, King George had told one of his courtiers. He will abdicate. I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne.
Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David.
The new king, David to his friends, but Edward VIII to the nation, watched the proclamation from a window in St. James's Palace, an unprecedented breach of etiquette. The woman at his side was Wallis Simpson.
God save the king!
The relationship with Mrs. Simpson had not yet been exposed in the British press. The Americans were less scrupulous.
Not for centuries had these Houses of Parliament witnessed so dangerous a political struggle. Rumors suppressed in England but headlined in America. Shall King Edward VIII marry Mrs. Simpson? Number 10 Downing Street was disturbed. Stanley Baldwin made visits to Buckingham Palace as talk spread that Mrs. Simpson might become queen. The king holds that marriage is his own private affair, and he's strong-willed and determined. There have been rumors that he might elope with her and abandon crown and throne for her, the lady from Baltimore, now the most publicized woman on earth.
In those days, the British press was prepared to respect the sovereign's private life, so long as it remained private. The King and Lord Beaverbrook had a gentleman's agreement to soft-pedal Mrs. Simpson's second divorce suit, but the press didn't know that the King had already decided to marry her the moment she was free. When the news finally broke in Britain, people were dumbfounded.
England loathed her. Britain loathed her. She'd taken from them the man they loved. I'm always surprised that she was never murdered. They loathed her. And there are still people that loathe her too.
All this was going on. I don't think the Duke and Duchess of York were really consulted much. and they go to shoot at Chatsworth one weekend. And she said it wasn't much fun because the Duke of Devonshire was in a frightful temper all the time because he was so furious with the King. And as we came back, we walked down the platform at Euston Station, and on a placard, I can see it now, she said, I saw the word abdication, and my heart turned over, and I thought, well, for it. She said, I don't believe I'd ever faced it till that minute. I never thought he would actually go.
A sickening sense of doom flooded over the Duke and Duchess of York. I feel like the proverbial sheep being led to the slaughter, wrote the Duke. Elizabeth sent a private letter to King Edward. Darling David, please read this. Please be kind to Bertie when you see him, because he loves you and minds terribly all that happens to you. You have no idea how hard it has been for him lately. I know that he is fonder of you than anybody else, and as his wife I must write to tell you this. It's awfully difficult for Bertie to say what he thinks. You know how shy he is, so do help him. I'm terrified for him, so do help him, and for God's sake don't tell him that I have written. Bertie went to plead with his brother, who was incommunicado at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. I could see that nothing I said would alter his decision, he wrote in his diary. I went to see Queen Mary, and when I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child. On Friday the 11th of December, that dreadful day, wrote Bertie, Dee and I said goodbye. We kissed, parted as Freemasons, and he bowed to me as his king.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as King as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
Whenever she talks about the abdication, she's really very generous about the Duke of Windsor. All I've ever heard her say was, and then he left. Well, it was a bit much, wasn't it? I thought that was an understatement. She's very apt to say, people don't realize we didn't know whether the country would accept us. You've no idea of the position held by the Duke of Windsor. But she doesn't like talking about it. It's too painful. She doesn't like talking about it.
The supreme moment came, wrote the king in his diary, when the Archbishop placed the crown on my head. It weighs 7 pounds, and I'd taken every precaution to see that it was put on the right way round, but the Dean and the Archbishop had been juggling with it so much that I never did know whether it was right or not. As I turned after leaving the coronation chair, I was brought up all standing, owing to one of the bishops treading on my robe. I had to tell him to get off it pretty sharply, as I nearly fell down. I thought it all very, very wonderful, wrote the 11-year-old Princess Elizabeth, and I expect the Abbey did too. The arches and beams at the top were covered with a sort of haze of wonder as Papa was crowned. At least I thought so. The curious thing, wrote the Queen to the Archbishop of Canterbury, is that we're not afraid. I feel that God has enabled us to face the situation calmly. What struck me as being rather odd, wrote Princess Elizabeth, was that Granny did not remember much of her own coronation. I should have thought that it would have stayed in her mind forever.
And I think that the country was enormously moved, you know, by... I mean, this is what the royal family does. It's archetypal, and it stands for this, that, and the other. And every now and then you get somebody like the poor old Duke of Windsor who lets it down in a way, but you've got to have him too, because he's part of reality. You know, you've got to have the naughty fairy as well as the good ones.
Far, far away in the Château de Condé, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor listened to the broadcast of the service. The words rolled over me like an engulfing wave, wrote the Duchess. All the while, the mental image of what might have been and should have been kept forming, disintegrating, and reforming in my mind.
There, is that enough?
Thank you very much. I hope you'll teach me that game someday, darling.
I love to.
Sir, I won't be as good as that, though. Well, sir, to change the subject, do you two ever have occasion to discuss what might have been?
Mr. Murray, I think you must be referring to the events of 1900, the crucial events in my life, in our lives, of 1936, and are wondering whether they have ever preoccupied our minds since that time. Well, now, the answer is most emphatically no. In the 20 years, close on 20 years since we married, there have been rewarding years, years of great happiness, years of no regrets, and years when we have preferred to look to the future rather than over our shoulders into the past.
But, David, don't you remember we always said we would never talk about what might have been? In fact, I think we arranged that pact on our honeymoon.
Yes, we did, and it's a pact and a vow that we've never broken.
What we all have to remember about darling Queen Elizabeth is that she never wanted to be queen. She was very, very happy as she was, with her two lovely young children and her husband, of whom she was very fond, but of whom she felt that he oughtn't to be subjected to too heavy pressures. But being a woman of enormous courage and with a stick of steel down the middle of her, you know, she's a strong woman. She said, well, I'm going to make a success of this, and I think that she made a tremendous difference in recovering after the abdication, which was a very serious blow to the monarchy in those days, very serious.
She felt that it shortened his life. He was the last person who wanted to take on this very, very heavy task. He was a very shy person, so therefore it was a tremendous effort to him to make speeches, to, you know, public occasions were an effort.
She was absolutely devoted to him, there's no doubt. And it doesn't at all like it being said that she carried the can. I mean, that she really spoke for both of them. No, she says people don't understand. He was a very strong character, and that's how she would like you to remember it, I'm sure.
If he got worried or fussed about anything, she would always manage to turn it into a joke or something. You know, if he got cross, which a lot of people do get cross at times, she would always, in a clever way, turn the whole thing round that it became a joke.
One day, the king, as he sometimes did, flew into a rage. The queen took his pulse between her fingers, her thumb and her fingers. She held his arm up a little bit like a nurse in a hospital. And she looked a little bit at the ceiling, and she said, tick, 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 your pulse is going very, very fast. And of course the king burst into laughter, and that was the end of the scene.
As 1937 unrolls its course, the peoples of the empire join together in defense of freedom. All eyes and thoughts are turned towards this son of the House of Windsor.
leader was choosing his people. Vienna heard the bombers roar, hung out the flags of black and red, and Austria was absorbed into the Reich. When he spoke, it was of Lebensraum, and wrongs now put right, but his was a hunger never appeased.
Amid the anxieties of this period, the forthcoming visit of the King and Queen to Canada and the United States stands out as one of the few peaceful signals on the horizon. From a picture such as this, you can gauge how the princesses are being brought up in a gentle, unpretentious atmosphere. The Queen holds down a corner of the map as the princesses pore over it, and the King shows them where the Repulse will steam up the estuary of the St. Lawrence to the big cities of the vast dominion of Canada. Then the King shows his daughters where he and their mother will go to stay with the President of the United States at Washington. As for Dookie, their dog, he's asking, am I in on this trip?
The situation was even grimmer than most people realized. If there was to be war with Nazi Germany, Britain needed the support of the powerful nations across the Atlantic.
These are the charming people who reign over us and millions of other subjects beyond the seas. How can the Canadians help liking them? And Americans too. They will take the King and Queen immediately to their hearts. Pray that nothing may stop their mission of friendship and goodwill.
Here, as surely as the sun shines brilliantly on the magnificent scene, is a moment that will live on in history, when the 40th of the long line of British monarchs and his Queen become the first ever to visit the New World, the first British ruler to set foot on the soil of one of his dominions.
And then our cameras turned upon the most amazing spectacle in the history of monarchy. Our King and Queen mingled with the crowd that swayed about them, chatting and laughing with complete informality.
The Queen had invented the royal walkabout. It was an amazing sight, wrote the Governor-General of Canada. They were simply swallowed up. I shall never forget the faces of the Scotland Yard detectives, but the veterans made a perfect bodyguard, weeping and crying, "Aye, man, if Hitler could just see this." The American correspondents were simply staggered. They said no American president would ever have dared to do that. It was a wonderful example of what true democracy means.
The royal train arrives in Washington, and appropriately to the scenes which follow, let me leave Movietone's American commentator, Lowell Thomas, to describe the welcome to our King and Queen.
In Union Station, they proceed to the reception room, where they're awaited by President and Mrs. Roosevelt. Friendly and wholehearted salutations. So glad to see you, delighted to be here. No stiffly starched diplomatic chill. American President and British sovereigns. They and their first ladies, like a party of friends. A close-up of royalty at its royal task.
It was the first time a reigning British monarch had set foot in the United States, which had booted the British out nearly 2 centuries before.
And she said, of course, it was a miracle, because we made friends with the Roosevelts, and the King used to sit up till the small hours talking to the President about the war, which was going to happen any minute.
Washington gets a spectacular show. The parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. King and President talking. I wonder what about.
Mrs. Roosevelt noted with interest that the Queen sat on a cushion which had springs to make it easier for her to keep up the continual bowing. The royal couple arrived at the Roosevelt family house to be greeted with a tray of cocktails. "My mother," said the President, "thinks you should have a cup of tea. She doesn't approve of cocktails." "Neither does my mother," replied the King, taking one. "I've never enjoyed meeting anyone more," the King said later. "Why don't my ministers talk to me as the President did tonight? I feel exactly as though a father were giving me his most careful and wise advice." "I nearly cried at the end of my last speech in Canada," said the King. "Everyone around me was crying. This tour has made us."
The mighty crowd clamors for the final greeting of the man and woman who have come to represent all our faith and ideals, of liberty, of peace, of toleration and freedom. for all the millions of their subjects throughout the world, and all of us today who are saying, welcome home.
They returned to a Europe suspended in a state of ominous quiet. War seemed inevitable, a boil waiting to burst. Every summer, the king sponsored a boys' camp. The idea was to help create a civilized society by breaking down class barriers. In August 1939, 100 public schoolboys spent a week with 100 factory apprentices at Abergeldy Castle, near Balmoral.
It's so lovely to be near royalty, so near, and with them, and seem part of the whole situation, the life of the whole situation, you know.
He's a jolly good fellow, and so say all of us.
There were no him and you. It was you were a team, very competitive, especially if you're playing a game of rugby. Oh, I'd never played rugby before. She would ask you as many questions as you asked her. Why, what, and wherefore. But very interested in you personally, as if you thought you were the most important person in that whole camp. Underneath the spreading chestnut tree, where you sat me on my knee. Yeah, it was good. She was concerned for us all. She felt sorry with the shadow of the war just on the horizon at the moment, but felt, you know, that she felt for all of us who will be involved, because we're all that sort of age, you know, we will be involved, you know. Well, the king mentioned that once. He says, you'll probably be in the conscription effort, and I hope we'll have the same team spirit. He says, I will do my best if you will do your best. Can we make that a promise?
And so it was, one Sunday morning in September. The seeds had long been sown, and all the land was waiting for the harvest.
Responsibility lies on the shoulders of one man. By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Against the mothers and children leaving the cities of Britain under the great evacuation scheme, with a smoothness and speed that avoids a single accident or delay. Terrible is the responsibility of the leader of the German Nazis for a catastrophe that will cause untold suffering, and may set back civilization perhaps for centuries. Her Majesty goes down to the country to see how London's evacuated children are getting along. She finds them healthy, happy, and above all, extremely busy. In the village hall, the Queen sees other children at play, and one little lady has many questions to ask the royal visitor on the best ways of stringing beads. And the Queen finds another little girl bathing her. Oh, excuse me, about those beads. The Queen finds another little girl bathing her dolly, and reminds her not to forget to wash behind the ears. And, those beads...
Ladies and gentlemen, Her Majesty, the Queen.
War has at all times called for the fortitude of women. Their lot was all the harder because they felt they could do so little beyond heartening through their own courage and devotion the men at the front. Now this is all changed, for we, no less than men, have real and vital work to do. We have all a part to play, and I know you will not fail in yours. Only when we have won through to an enduring peace shall we be free to work unhindered for the greater happiness and well-being of all mankind.
She was wonderful in the war. I can remember quite often being with them, you know, and once having to go down to the air raid shelter in the bowels of Windsor Castle. And there was a particularly bad raid. And all the People were trying to make Queen Elizabeth hurry up to get there, upon which she walked slower and slower and slower, just to show them that she wasn't going to be frightened into hurrying to the air raid shelter.
The world's greatest city rides in flames, an epic of courage that stirs the hearts of free men everywhere. Dawn and devastation in a Britain under siege. Life becomes a nightmare in which 50,000 are killed or injured in the first 5 months.
4/5 of the first casualties were in London, most of them in the working class areas around the docks. The East Enders were bitter to be carrying the brunt of the bombing. There was relief in the Ministry of Information when the Germans, as Harold Nicholson put it, smashed about Bond Street and Park Lane and readjusted the balance.
Helping England take it are Britain's beloved rulers. They visit every stricken area. Royalty and commoner stand united, unflinching.
What to wear while visiting the bombed areas was a knotty problem. The Queen wanted to dress smartly. "Of course I do," she said. "If the poor people came to see me, they would put on their best clothes." Black would feel defeatist, and her usual rainbow colours were not appropriate, so Norman Hartnell dressed her in dusty lilac, dusty blue and dusty pink, shades that conveyed sympathy and encouragement, and had the advantage of not showing the dust. On September the 13th, 1940, Buckingham Palace itself was hit. The King and Queen had been standing by the window. "B asked me to take an eyelash out of his eye," she wrote to her mother-in-law, "and while I was battling with this task, we heard an unmistakable whir, whir."
We had this plane coming down the Mall, and then there wasn't any warning at all, and then this extraordinary scream that a bomb makes, you know. And the first one has exploded in the quadrangle, really not very far from us. We saw it actually explode, and a great column of water came into the air. It also hit some of the great drain system too. And one nasty thing was that the garden got inundated with rats, horrible rats. However, everybody had great fun pursuing them, trying to shoot them.
"A magnificent piece of bombing, ma'am," said a palace policeman, "if you'll pardon my saying so."
The bombs went sort of crooked, and luckily they weren't killed. It killed the gatekeeper, which is so sad, and then it hit the chapel and the swimming pool and the middle of the quadrangle, and mercifully missed the king. So, you know, it was a bit of luck.
I think that was us looking round to see what had gone. I asked Cecil Beaton to take these really just to remind us of what extraordinary state the house is in, you know, because most of the pictures naturally had gone, and some of the furniture, and there were no windows at all left at the end of the wall. Just and these are all cisterns and bars to catch the rain coming through. Sorry, old house.
"I'm glad we've been bombed," the Queen said. "I feel I can look the East End in the face. The damage there is ghastly," she wrote to her mother-in-law. "I really felt as if I was walking in a dead city. It does affect me seeing this terrible and senseless destruction. I think that really I mind it much more than being bombed myself. The people are marvellous and full of fight. We must win in the end."
I was window dressing with Marks and Spencer at the time, and I lost an awful lot of friends in that raid. People, well, I was quite notorious in East Ham High Street. I went out to have a look at my window, and as I looked down the road I could see a crowd. I thought, well, I'll go and see what it is. So I gets up there, and just as we did, they brought a person out, a friend of mine, out, a body out. And of course that started me weeping. And someone said to me, "Isn't it terrible?" I said, "Terrible's not the word for it." And I'm, you know, rattling on about them, and I said, "No," I said, "I'm just expecting my first baby." I was just at the beginning of my pregnancy. I said, it makes you wonder whether it's worth bringing it in to this world." And I said, I've lost so many friends, you know. I was crying so much, I didn't see who it was. All of a sudden I heard someone say, Your Majesty. And I looked, I said, I didn't realise I was speaking to you, Your Majesty. She said, that's all right, my dear, she said. And she put her arm round my shoulder. I was speaking to her as if she was just an ordinary person. Well, she is, really. She said, we've had a very, very sad but very friendly conversation. She says, now pull yourself together. She says, you don't want to lose that baby you're expecting. She says, and think of your husband.
They were stable, they were relaxed to all appearances. The monarchical institution operated by that married couple was, I think, a very important factor in keeping public opinion united and firm and determined to go on. After all, on paper, we had lost the war in 1914. It was only a matter of time. And nobody would accept this. And they didn't accept it either.
Embattled Britain, led by Winston Churchill, is heartened by the voice of democracy. Royalty and commoner, Prime Minister and people stand united, unflinching.
Every Tuesday, Winston Churchill had lunch alone with the King. They'd got off to a sticky start because Churchill had supported the Duke of Windsor during the abdication crisis. But these lunches, particularly when they were joined by the Queen, helped turn a working relationship into friendship. I could not have a better Prime Minister, wrote the King in his diary. Meanwhile, the safety of the princesses was a continual worry. The Nazis, both in Norway and in Holland, wrote Lord Hailsham to Churchill, made a desperate effort to capture the royal family. No doubt they will do the same in this country if they can, and I suggest the time has come to send the princesses to Canada. If the Nazis got hold of their persons, they would be able to bring tremendous pressure to bear on the King and Queen by threatening death and even worse things.
She wouldn't hear of the princesses being sent away. They couldn't go without me, and I would never leave the King, so that was that. Which was an important decision, wasn't it?
For most of the war, the princesses were confined to Windsor Castle. 2 troops of armoured cars stood by to whisk them off to safety if the Germans invaded Britain. And for day-to-day protection, there was a small company of Grenadier Guardsmen.
It was thought that the Germans might really try and abduct the princesses. A company from the battalion was sent up to the castle. 5 officers lived in the castle. 2 of us had all our meals with them. The Queen was only 14 when I first went down. Princess Margaret was 10. They had a deadly life, really, because they were imprisoned in the castle. I mean, they weren't allowed beyond the edge of the Home Park golf course, where there was a barbed wire fence. And that went on really for months. And they had 2 governesses. I mean, I can't think it was very amusing for them. 2 officers may possibly have lightened the meals a little bit at lunch.
Well, of course, the house, which is very solidly built and good old castle, and felt nice and safe there. But of course, there was nothing in it. You know, they'd taken away the pictures, and there was one light in every room, and one couldn't see out because of the blackout and the stuff on the windows, and wire cages to stop the flying glass and all that, so it made it very dark.
And the King and Queen used to go off every morning at 8 by a special train to visit the bombed cities. And therefore you had to picture her talking to people who'd lost their homes and almost talking to people underground, not yet dug out. And they used to come back at 8 and they used to have dinner on their own in, I think, what's called the Star Chamber in the corner of the courtyard. And after dinner, which was probably 10 o'clock, they used to come in to meet us, to the staff, about 6 of us. And I've never forgotten her sitting up till midnight, cracking jokes, being frightfully amusing about these terrible experiences. I mean, with feeling, but saying, and I have no idea the things we've had to do today. Well, they've been to Liverpool or somewhere, quite extraordinary.
Wherever their majesties go, they meet the same high courage. The predominant sounds during this visit were cheering crowds, wailing sirens, and cries of
We can take it, Your Majesties. We can take it.
I don't think you could beat the King, supported by Queen Elizabeth, with those two children in the background. I was a pretty tough lot, you know. I mean, it's a strong team, that. Marvellous. I mean, it's a strong archetypal team. It's a family. Now, I don't know much about the Duke of Windsor, but I don't think he would have done it as well. In fact, I'm sure he wouldn't. That's my view.
One sensed far more the setting of ordinary family life in this generation than the last, wrote Queen Mary's lady-in-waiting, Lady Airlie, after a visit to Sandringham. It was in the way the King said you must ask Mummy when his daughters wanted to do something, just as any father would. In Princess Margaret's pout when the Queen sent her back to the house to put on a thicker coat, like any 14-year-old girl's. The King is a devoted father. He spoils Princess Margaret and treats her as an enfant terrible, but Princess Elizabeth is his constant companion in shooting, walking, riding, in fact in everything. His affection for her is touching. I wondered sometimes whether he is secretly dreading the prospect of an early marriage.
Because in a way the war meant that they had quite a lot of time together, because they had to be at Windsor, wherever it was. And she wasn't, of course, going abroad all the time, as she would have been if the war hadn't been on. And so I think, in a way, that period, from the point of view of the family, was quite good.
2 years ago, it was Germany which had the monopoly on the word invasion. Today, the fortress Europa is on the defensive, and when paratroops descend, history will have turned full cycle.
The war reached its climax with the invasion of Europe in June 1944. As D-Day approached, the King was eager to cross the Channel with the troops and be there to see the first attack. I told Elizabeth about the idea, and she was wonderful as always, and encouraged me to do it. Churchill was keen to go too, but the King's private secretary was appalled at the thought that Prime Minister and monarch might be killed simultaneously. With some difficulty, both were persuaded to stay behind.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King!
Thousands upon thousands went to the palace, for this is a way we have in Great Britain. The family and the head of the family rejoice together.
Moore came 2 years after they came to the throne. And I think it was the sort of, not the highlight, I don't mean that, but it was such a traumatic thing to happen so early in their reign that I think it's something that she's lived with somehow ever since, in a way. You know, it was, I suppose, the most sort of telling moment of their lives.
Once, when the King and Queen were visiting the East End during the height of the Blitz, a man shouted out, "Thank God for a good king." "Thank God for a good people," replied the King, deeply touched. Those 6 years had strengthened the bond between monarchy and country, but the cost to the King's health was evident. He described himself as burned out. Queen Elizabeth had coped magnificently with war. Now she was going to need all her strength to cope with peace.
The Queen and I know the ordeals which you have endured throughout the Commonwealth and Empire. We are proud to have shared some of them with you.
But the elation was short-lived. Churchill was kicked out and replaced by Attlee's Labour government. The new mood was one of puritanical austerity. "One fears that this winter is going to be difficult," wrote Queen Elizabeth to a friend. "Little fuel, no more clothes, monotonous and sparse food, and no bombing to liven us up. But people are not being killed, and that's the main thing."
Icy winds, heavy frost, and quite a bit of snow. That's what it's been like in Britain lately, as you've probably noticed. Real austerity weather.
In the middle of the worst winter of the century, the royal family was committed to a lengthy tour of sun-drenched South Africa. They left their subjects snowbound and shivering in the grip of a fuel crisis. "I know Bertie feels he should be at home," wrote the Queen to her mother-in-law. In the Bay of Biscay they hit a squall that sent everyone, except for the Queen, scurrying to their beds. "At last we sailed into calm waters," reported the King's Equerry Group Captain Peter Townsend. A warm wind blew and the Queen remarked, "It's like being stroked." The princesses had never been out of the British Isles before. "Poor darlings, they have never had any fun yet," wrote the King in his diary.
I looked after both the princesses. Lady Harlech was the lady of the bedchamber. Lady de la Peel was the woman of the bedchamber. I was a sort of neither fresh fish nor fowl, neither a lady or a woman. I was in between the two, I think. So I looked after both the princesses.
Princess Elizabeth had been reluctant to come. She was 20 years old and in love with a young naval lieutenant, Prince Philip of Greece. She'd first noticed him when she was 13. "We both think she's too young for that now," the King wrote to his mother, "as she has never met any young men of her own age."
The Queen was somebody who adored fun. There was a reunion. I hadn't seen her for years. A little before she got to me, she made a little sign. I hope not too many people saw it, but it was the sign one used to make when dancing the boogie-woogie. The royal family enjoyed the Lambeth Walk, the boogie-woogie. I came, I saw, I conquered. They all joined in with tremendous spirit and verve.
South Africa was the youngest of the dominions. But during the war there had been increasing political tension between the two white races, the English speakers and the anti-British Afrikaners. It threatened the stability of this branch of the empire. The blacks, though essential to the whites' way of life, were politically invisible. The royal family were there to help heal the divisions with a feast of loyalty.
3 hours of smiling. I mean, your face stuck after a bit. You can't really smile at nothing, can you, quite? Not really. You try and smile at nothing for hours on end. Queen Elizabeth was marvellous. I mean, she, you know, was a great example of how not to flag on occasion like that. I mean, you never saw her give in or give up. She has that magic with people, hasn't she? She gets so much from people. In return, they give a lot to her.
A police officer, wrote Peter Townsend, was heard explaining to a group of pickaninnies, "That is Mr. King, and next to him is Mrs. King, then just behind Princess Elizabeth King and Princess Margaret King." But the King was tugged by his sense of duty. He kept saying, reported the journalist James Cameron, that he should be at home and not lolling about in the summer sun.
The white train winds its graceful way through scrub and dry hill country to Zululand. Each coach was air-conditioned and had its own automatic telephone system.
"30 days in the Royal Train." It was a lovely train, but it was still a train, you know. Talk about mad dogs and Englishmen. It didn't sort of have a siesta from 2 to 4, anything like normal people do in that sort of country. Even if you were in the middle of your dinner and you came into some village and there were these poor people who had been standing by the railway line for 2 or 3 days, that you got out to talk to them on the line. So that went on up till 11 o'clock or even later sometimes.
So you couldn't, what I call, get into your dressing gown and go to bed. It was a very, very exhausting tour. It was more strain perhaps for him than for her. I think it did affect his health. I think they always said that it really started all his troubles, really. The tension of, always.
It was a really great day for Barotseland, for the King and Queen were visiting the Protectorate. Resplendent in his super uniform, the chief had previously been paddled 300 miles downstream for this great affair. The leader of the paddlers in the canoe certainly knows his job.
The King and Queen were surprised and disturbed by the hostilities they found bubbling below the surface of the celebrations.
I remember one occasion we were in the royal train, and there's a long tablecloth with the crest and the motto Ex Unitate Vires. The king smashed it. There was not much unitate about this place.
In Rhodesia, the King and Queen took time off to pay homage at the grave of its founder, Cecil Rhodes.
She was proud of the fact that we were an empire. She was proud of what we did in the empire. She does not like the denigrating of people like Rhodes. She feels that we did a good job and it was pity that it had to come to an end for the reasons why it had to come to an end.
Superficially, it was successful. There was always a vague hope that it would do something to improve the basic politics of South Africa. But of course it didn't work that way.
A year later, the Afrikaner Nationalist Party took over the country and established apartheid, the enforced segregation of the white and the black races. The South African tour, which had started as a holiday, left them all exhausted, ground down by the relentless round of engagements. At the end of one grueling day, the king had shouted, "Off parade at last!" He threw his hat in the air, and the Queen kicked it into the dining room. They were glad to be going home. They had been away 4 months. The enforced absence had confirmed Princess Elizabeth's resolve to marry her naval lieutenant.
Yes?
"We keep wondering whether Philip realizes what he's in for," the king was heard to say at a cocktail party that autumn.
Thank you very much.
"I think the King and Queen were right to make her wait a while," said Queen Mary. "After all, he had to wait long enough for his wife, and you can see what a success their marriage is." "When I handed your hand to the Archbishop," wrote the king to his daughter, "I felt that I had lost something very precious. I have watched you grow up all these years with pride under the skillful direction of Mummy, who, as you know, is the most marvellous person in the world in my eyes. Your leaving us has left a great blank in our lives, but do remember that your old home is still yours, and do come back to it as much and as often as possible. Don't forget us is the wish of your ever-loving and devoted Papa." "They grow up and leave us, and we must make the best of it," said the Queen. But the king was not well. He'd lost 17 pounds during the exhausting South African tour. For some time he'd had cramp in both legs. Now his left foot had become numb. The pain kept him awake at night.
He used to go out shooting and so on, and then he'd come back and you'd see him hitting his leg to try and restore the circulation. The king and his brother, Duke Gloucester, were both heavy smokers. It was the primary cause, according to his surgeon. He then had trouble with the lung, and he had to have an operation for the removal of the lung. That was really much more serious. That was done by a very well-known thoracic surgeon, and the extraordinary thing was he was an absolute compulsive smoker. Here he was, cutting people's lungs out because they were full of tobacco and smoking himself like Jimmy. Extraordinary.
He was such a delightful and charming person, and she realised that he was, he was becoming frail. It was always concealed as much as possible, and as little as possible was made of it. And he was very brave about his difficulties.
To London Airport come the King and Queen to speed their daughter and her husband on the first stage of their 30,000-mile journey to Australia and New Zealand. Princess Elizabeth and the Duke are taking the place of their Majesties, who were to have made the tour. It is good to see His Majesty looking so well.
The king and his daughter would never see each other again. The king's health was deteriorating faster than anyone suspected. He returned to Sandringham with the Queen. February the 5th was dry, cold and sunny, a perfect day. King George went out shooting hares, while the Queen and Princess Margaret took a boat trip on the Norfolk Broads and visited their friend, the artist Edward Seago. "I got back to Sandringham rather late," wrote Queen Elizabeth to him a fortnight later, "and, as I always did, rushed straight to the King's room. I found him so well, so gay, and so interested in our lovely cruise on the river. I told him you had sent the pictures back in my car, and we went straight to the hall where they'd been set out, and we spent a very happy time looking at them together. We had such a truly gay dinner, with the King like his old self, and more picture-looking after dinner." But early on the morning of February the 6th, the King's heart stopped beating. He was only 56. His private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, rang Edward Ford in London.
Lascelles just said, "Hyde Park Corner," which is the code for "the King is dead." I drove to Downing Street. I was shown straight up to Mr. Churchill's bedroom, where there he was in bed, his bed strewn with papers. I said to him, "Prime Minister, I'm afraid I've got bad news. The King is dead." He said, "Bad news? The worst." And then he sort of stopped, like that. And then he threw the papers away and said how unimportant these are.
This is London. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today that the King passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
Meanwhile, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were watching the dawn at treetops in the foothills of Mount Kenya. Their entourage was caught unprepared.
By the time I got there, she knew where she was. She didn't exactly change, but she was more so. She sat straighter in her chair. She looked Queen, too, straight away. She absolutely took her destiny in both hands. She understands duty and destiny. She learned a great deal from Queen Elizabeth. See, Queen Elizabeth was a strong woman.
A few seconds after 11 o'clock, the King's last journey from Sandringham began. On a gun carriage they drew the royal coffin. On it rested one wreath from the Queen Mother.
"He was so young to die," wrote Queen Elizabeth to a friend. "He was so kind, too, and had a sort of natural nobility of thought and life, which sometimes made me ashamed of my narrower and more feminine point of view." "Poor lady," said her page, Kemp. "She never had time to cry." For 3 days the King's body lay in state in Westminster Hall. 300,000 people came to pay their respects. The king was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Beside his tomb are inscribed the words he'd quoted in his first Christmas broadcast of the war.
I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way.
When my husband died, she was in touch very quickly. I said to her, you know, it is awful, isn't it, getting readjusted after a long, long marriage. And she said, oh yes, it is, very hard. And I said, does it get better? And she said, no, it never gets better, but you get better at it.
She didn't see people for a long, long time. She wouldn't see anybody. And he died in February, and about, I think, sort of July, August time, or late in the summer, when she was up in Scotland, somebody rang me from Balmoral and said that Winston Churchill was there and wanted to know how she was and what. And he knew she wasn't seeing anybody. And I said, don't ask. Tell him to come over. Just to come over. And so he came without asking if he should, you know. So she'd see him. And she saw him. And from then on, she started to see people again. I think he must have said things which made her realize how important it was for her to carry on. How much people wanted her to go around and see them as she had before. From then on, instead of saying no to everybody, we started to say yes and started to do things.
Her Majesty, our Colonel in peace. Hip, hip. Hip, hip.
Later that summer, the poet Edith Sitwell received a letter from Queen Elizabeth. I started to read the anthology you sent me, sitting by the river, and it was a day when one felt engulfed by great black clouds of unhappiness and misery. And I found a sort of peace stealing round my heart as I read such lovely poems and heavenly words. I found a hope in George Herbert's poem, who would have thought my shrivelled heart could have recovered greenness? It was gone quite underground. And I thought how small and selfish is sorrow. But it bangs one about until one is senseless. And I can never thank you enough for giving me such a delicious book wherein I found so much beauty and hope. An essential element in the healing process came from a chance discovery in Caithness, the northeastern tip of Scotland.
I was driving along and we looked down, we saw this old castle. And then I discovered that it was going to be pulled down. And I thought, oh dear. So I took it on and it wasn't in a very good state, you know, the roof was really off. And I think it took about 12 years to build it up, little by little, you know, roof on first, bathrooms, water, electric light, which was a great thrill. And so it's been a rather lovely thing, you know, to build up something that might have gone forever.
It was the first place she'd been to where there weren't associations with the king. And she got a little sort of relaxation and peace from it.
From that moment, the Queen Mother divided her time between 4 residences. 3 of them belong to the Crown: Clarence House next door to Buckingham Palace, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, and Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate. The Castle of May is the only one that she herself owned.
Going up to Scotland again in August, it's rather like school breaking up and the holidays begin. She heads north, works over, and it's moved up to holiday time.
I don't really love it, because it's very bleak, and it's just acres of flat, damp heather with a few wind-blown trees. Not much tree life. Well, there are very few and far between, and what there are bent double with the gale from the North Pole.
It's frightfully windy, of course. You see, it's right on. I mean, you can see the Orkneys from it, and the wind blows like the devil. And it rains, but it's lovely. I mean, she goes there in August. It's all right, but it wouldn't be quite so jolly as I know, I don't think, in November. Not so jolly.
Since the death of the King, the Queen Mother's life had gone through difficult changes. She was no longer privy to political decisions. She was forced to move out of Buckingham Palace. She was obliged to take a supporting role at her daughter's coronation. But she was determined to impress her sense of the sovereign's duty on the next generation. "Work is your devoir," she was fond of telling her daughter. "The rent you pay for life." The man who'd renounced his duty was not there to see his niece crowned. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, despite their pleas, had not received an invitation. It was 14 years later, when a memorial to Queen Mary was unveiled in the Mall, that Wallis Windsor and the Queen Mother met for the first time since the abdication.
Somehow the myth has developed over the ages that Queen Elizabeth is a sort of bitter woman who has held a grudge against the Windsors. And I think that is totally erroneous. I mean, in all the years that I've known her, I've never actually heard her say anything about the Duchess of Windsor.
I've been with her for over 30 years, and she has never spoken about it to me, or about. I don't think she's ever mentioned Mrs. Simpson. To say that it's the one thing that's made her sort of bitter and twisted is simply not true.
She's very fed up with that, books being written. She said, "I met her twice." No, I mean, she had no occasion to realize what she was like.
One of the events that took place whilst I was at Windsor was the death of the Duchess of Windsor. And there was a lot of speculation in the press about what Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, would do and whether she would be there. She was wonderful, serene, calm, but she must have had her own private feelings.
She talks about what's going on today all the time, I find. I mean, she's not I mean, if you're with her, you don't spend all the time talking about the past or anything like it. You talk about the present, what fun it all is. You do really, you know. And, you know, what the politicians are doing, and that isn't always fun. But never mind, you talk about it, and you laugh at it. You have fun.
Queen Elizabeth was only 51 when the King died, too young to retreat into self-effacing widowhood. She had been removed from the hub of the nation's life, but she set to work creating a new career for herself, a recurring round of ceremonial duties, of public and private diversions. She achieved an equilibrium by dividing her life into different compartments, each with its own responsibilities and its own pleasures. She was even able to indulge in some things she'd never had time for as Queen, such as private holidays abroad.
One day my husband said to Queen Elizabeth,
"Have you been to the Loire?" And she said, "I've always longed to go, but I've never been." And that was how it started. The next time we went, it was to Provence. And Queen Elizabeth took a very small house. I think it just had about 4 bedrooms.
The little house belonged to Jean Sand, who was a chief decorator in Paris at the time, and whose taste was curious, to put it mildly.
I tell you, his theme was frogs.
Frogs.
Which I particularly dislike. And they were everywhere. They were in the bathroom. They were certainly in the garden.
On the fireplace.
Everywhere.
China frogs. We had a good laugh about that.
Charles and I took her out to dinner, and I think she said it was only the second time that she'd been in a restaurant since she married.
The French are really very jealous of us for having a royal family, and so she takes over as queen. I remember she was sailing through Provence with people throwing flowers into her car, and Ruth Vermoy saying to me, "You see, she has become Queen of Provence." I'm rather nervous when she arrives. I mean, there was a duke who wouldn't sit next to her, wasn't there?
Yes, and one other person had a heart attack as a result. They usually warn her and say, "I think we should just tell your Majesty that the mayor is a communist." And she says, "But I love communists."
We stayed in a lovely chateau called Sully, near Beaune, I mean in the heart of the wine country. And one evening, the hostess, the Duchess of Magenta, had a party, and all the people from Beaune came and sang, and drank a good deal of Burgundy, and Ruth Vermoy played the piano. It went on till heaven knows what hour, about 1 in the morning, and eventually she said, "I think we must go to bed." So we all went up to her bedroom, and the bedroom window looked out over the moat. There was a bridge over the moat, and the people were coming away from the party. And at this particular house, she'd been given, the sous-prefet's wife had given her a little present, which was a mouth organ. And she said, "Perfect." Put it in her bag. And when she got to her bedroom, she said to me, "Hold the lamp over my head." And she leant out the window, and toot-toot on her mouth organ, she played the Marseillaise. And one of the people, one of the sons-in-law, had a French horn, and he tootled back with his horn. I thought, it's about 2 in the morning. What these people at Beaune must have thought when they got home. They couldn't believe it. The little blue figure at the window playing the mouth organ.
These holidays took the Queen Mother to France 17 times, to Italy 5 times, but other European countries have proved less enticing.
They think in a way there's so much, I mean, I'm probably quite wrong about Germany, but I mean, I don't think there's anywhere quite as, probably as attractive as there would be in either France or Italy, you know. I don't think she feels a yen to go to Germany.
I went out with her once when she went to Germany, and it was the most extraordinary experience, standing in the Kurhaus, whatever they call the town hall in Germany, and seeing a German mayor presenting flowers and making warm speeches to somebody I saw as having been one of the pivots of resistance during the war. She was then, when they had the reconciliation service at Coventry, and the President of Germany came over, she did that ceremony without any sense that she had any resentment against them at all.
I present to you this cross of nails from Coventry, a symbol of reconciliation, friendship, and peace. And may God bless the people of your country.
She minds about the war. You know, it's her generation. You can feel by looking into her face that she really is feeling gratitude for those who gave their lives, sorry that they've gone, but always courage.
She is Colonel-in-Chief of my old regiment. The regiment was serving in Germany at Herne. And she said to my wife and I, "You must come out with me to our regiment." And we duly flew out in the Royal Flight. Spoils you for ordinary travel. And Queen Elizabeth duly presented the standard. And then, on the way back, she sat in her seat exactly opposite mine. And Queen Elizabeth turned her head round to the window and put her hand up to her face. And I thought, oh dear, she's tired. It's been a long day. And then suddenly she dropped her hand, turned round to me, and the tears were pouring down her face. And she said, "I've been thinking what it must have been like for you today when I presented that standard, when your son was killed in action in the regiment only last year." It's that sort of thing. That's very moving.
The ideal of the family permeated Queen Elizabeth's life. Among her collection of paintings is one by Paul Nash, which had a particular significance for her.
It's a magical picture, rather, isn't it? It's always changing a little bit. Different light, and, you know, it looks quite different.
It hangs in our sitting room. She says, "I think it's a very important picture, that, you know." And I lent it to the Queen when she was having Charles. It hung over her bed. That's rather interesting. She said, "I thought it would make her think nice thoughts."
After the christening, Queen Elizabeth got out the family photograph albums and they all tried to decide who the baby looked like. Queen Mary said he was the image of his great-great-great-grandfather, Prince Albert. But Queen Elizabeth herself was convinced he looked more like her own husband, the King. Ever since I can remember, Prince Charles has written, "My grandmother has been the most wonderful example of fun, laughter, warmth, infinite security, and above all else, exquisite taste in so many things."
She is immensely close to Prince Charles. He really dotes on her. And they have the most charming relationship. I mean, it's really a pleasure to see overt love between two generations, you know.
I remember a story when she was taking Prince Charles to meet the parents. I hadn't seen him for a long time. She told me this herself. He was only about 5 or 4. And as she arrived at the station, she thought, "Oh heavens, I haven't told Charles that the regiment are going to present arms and that the noise of the guns going on to the platform." And he's very musical, will frighten him. It was too late, I couldn't do anything. I said, "Oh, what did you do?" I was so afraid he was going to cry. She said, "So all I did was to hold his hand very, very tight." And I was very proud of Charles. He got crimson in the face, but he never cried.
When you're in a room with two people who've fallen in love, there's just something in the air. It's electric. It goes beyond what we might all feel for a grandchild. She respects him. She thinks he's got humanity, vision, decency, courage, the virtues, and a lot of jokes, a lot of humour. She likes that side of him. He's very good at teasing her. And I think his load sort of falls from him. So you see, you know, the real man.
Granny was christened in this. Great-granny. And I was. Look, I was christened in this.
Her ideas on marriage are very much of her generation.
I
I think he's even going to give a smile, isn't he?
She feels if you marry, you take on. I mean, you don't go into it, and she feels very strongly that you don't go into it and bail out in it when it gets a bit tough.
But modern princes and princesses don't always live happily ever after, and the Queen Mother was distressed to see each friction between Charles and Diana exposed and chewed over in public.
Often she would say to me, there are some things that ought to be private. And I think most human families would actually agree with that. I don't think any ordinary family would actually want all its affairs exposed to public gaze. We all of us have a right to privacy and a need for privacy. And I think there is a feeling that she had, particularly, that privacy was sometimes denied them. The trouble is that as soon as you do open things up and try and be more with it, it becomes a soap opera. And the soap opera has to be fed. That is something that she regretted very much indeed.
Group Captain Peter Woolridge Townsend, mentioned in dispatches, former equerry to Her Majesty.
The first family crisis the Queen Mother had to cope with after the death of the King was in 1955, when Princess Margaret announced that she wanted to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Because he was divorced, the government withheld its approval. Without it, she would lose her royal status and her civil list income.
Much has happened since the days, recalled now by Pathé News, when he accompanied the royal tour of South Africa as an equerry to King George VI.
They were so very nice because I just come from nowhere. I stepped almost out of a cockpit into the home of the royal family, and they were simply sweet. The Queen had the most wonderful blue eyes, which normally, with that, everybody knows this wonderful and encouraging and reassuring smile she has. But even keeping the smile going, sometimes with a little difficulty, if she was angry, the eyes would gleam, and that was enough. Anyway, it was enough for me. I presume it was enough for the daughters as well.
Margaret had to decide whether she'd rather be a princess or a housewife. Queen Elizabeth avoided any sensible discussion. She said plaintively that Margaret hadn't even thought about where they were going to live. Prince Philip said sarcastically that it was still possible even nowadays to buy a house. The Queen Mother left the room, angrily slamming the door behind her.
She's not very good at facing up to a difficult decision that has to be made about... I mean, she will do it, but it's not something that she's very good at. Tommy Lascelles called her the Imperial Ostrich.
She was very wonderful all the way through. Simply wonderful. That's all I can say.
This is the BBC. The following personal message was issued from Clarence House by Princess Margaret about an hour ago. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend.
Princess Margaret walking with Mr. Anthony Armstrong-Jones, and they're obviously as happy as any engaged couple could be. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, left the lodge to join them. It needs no imagination to understand Her Majesty's great joy in this betrothal.
Lord Snowdon's 18-year marriage to Princess Margaret ended after a 2-year separation, on the grounds that it had broken down irretrievably.
Over the years, the Queen Mother had to watch the younger generations of her family go through the sort of turbulence that would have been unthinkable in her youth. Worst of all, it was happening in full view of the nation.
I mean, she's got, I suppose, inevitably old-fashioned views, because those sort of things have gone out of fashion, of being maritally single-minded, and you know, she has strong views about what is right and wrong, from which nothing would make her deviate.
Late in the summer of 1997, the royal soap opera turned into tragedy with the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Two days after the funeral, the Queen Mother was the first member of the royal family back on duty. She flew to Inverness to honour an engagement as Colonel-in-Chief of the Black Watch, the regiment that had seen her return to public life after the death of the King.
Her line is, "The show goes on," and sometimes people may think that is a sign of little feeling. I don't think that's true for a moment. Not for a moment.
She has a core of steel inside her. She I've never really known her lose her temper. And heavens, we've been probably aggravating enough to her, but she's never lost her temper.
She's a wonderful mollifier. At the same time, she doesn't give away anything of her integrity in doing it. I met her at the opening of Dundee University, where I was elected the first rector, and she was the chancellor. It was at the worst time of student difficulties, which was 68, and there was an air of revolution all over the place. As we came in this solemn procession in Dundee, the students pelted us with toilet rolls, which they kept held at one end, like streamers in a ball, and threw the other end. And the Queen Mother stopped and picked these up as though somebody had misplaced them. "Was this yours? Oh, would you take it?"
She never has any fear of people. I mean, I can remember driving back from the Jubilee in 77, and the royal family had appeared on the balcony, and we were due to drive, and the police suddenly insisted that Queen Elizabeth was to go out right through the gardens of Buckingham Palace and up the whole way round the wall. And the crowds were dispersing, so it wasn't a question of safety. She said, "Absolute nonsense, I'm going straight across in front, there's absolutely no danger, don't be so silly." And she wouldn't listen, and they had to send to the master of the household, who arrived down rather nervously, and had to say to her, "Look here, ma'am, this is the police, this is advice, you really have got to take it." She did, in the end, with very ill grace, I may say. And we drove right the way round. It took us over half an hour to get back to Clarence House. And when she got out of the car at the other end, still rather angry, she turned to her own detective and said, "That was extremely pusillanimous." And when we went into the house, she turned to me and said, "I'm so glad I got that word out." But of course she was absolutely right. We could have gone straight across, and they would merely have cheered at it.
On one of the hottest days of the century, the Queen Mother presided over an enormous birthday party outside her London home. Nearly all had brought flowers, cards, and a variety of gifts they hoped the Queen Mother would appreciate.
It's a rather sort of enjoyable private eye sort of cliché. The Queen Mother is always quietly lit. It's certainly not my experience. She likes the ritual and the fun, the party feeling that there are drinks. There'll be drinks, she says, you see. And then, you know, one watches like a hawk what's going down, and it's usually a bit of a dubonnet.
Before going up to lunch, it was a thing to do. She went into my little private office for a tidy, as they call it, you know, get ready to go upstairs for luncheon. And I always had this office sort of tarted up a bit, not like a normal bog standard stuff, with a nice bit of chintz here and there, you know. And the Duchess of Devonshire looked after the bar when they went in there. The Queen Mother's favourite tipple was gin and dubonnet. They were in there for about half an hour, and when they came out, the Duchess of Devonshire and Queen Mum didn't look too happy either, and I thought, oh my God, what's gone wrong? And because after lunch and the Queen Mother had gone, I said, what was the matter?
Grace, you came out looking so furious. She said, I was on my knees on front of this cabinet trying to find a Dubai, and there wasn't any Dubai, and it wasn't very funny. I laddered my stockings, she said.
Gin and Dubonnet was a cocktail fashionable in the 1930s. In this, as in so many ways, the Queen Mother spent her life cocooned in familiarity.
The teas are like the sort of fantasies one had as a schoolboy in austerity. Brown bread and butter, white bread and butter, cucumber sandwiches, egg sandwiches, probably some sort of potted meat sandwich, always a chocolate cake and always a fruit cake. Huge bowls of shrimps from the wash, all properly hand-picked and peeled, which is labour like making a Swiss watch. This is a sort of comfortable upper-class household of 1935 or 6. Absolutely no concessions. I think the Queen has rightly and heroically and with some difficulty protected her from change. The economic assumptions that underlie that are staggering.
Dogs as well.
Dogs are marvellous.
Oh dear. Oh, thank you very much.
She's always somebody that's interested in comfort. I remember once seeing her at a private dinner. My eye went down and there she was wearing her usual peak-toed shoes with straps of rhinestones. Well, nearly all the rhinestones had gone, but I thought, I know why you've got those shoes on, because they're jolly comfortable. And that's the essence of the woman.
These are some of the shoes we made for Queenie Mum in the 50s. I've managed to get an inch knocked off of what she used to wearing. Normally they would ring up and say, oh, can you come down Wednesday? So you get a bit excited and then you think, oh, it's just an ordinary lad from the Elephant and Castle going to see the Queen Mum. So it was a bit daunting at first, but she makes you so relaxed when you see her, and that it's just like talking to your nan. These are patterns that the Queen Mums have had over the years. They're not in any particular order. If you're coming into the shop for the first time, have your foot measured, and the first pair of shoes will be about £700. And then after that, we're talking about £300, £350 for every pair after that.
She never says, actually, I'd rather have it a bit more like this or a bit more like that, but it's just the action, and I know what she wants. So by the time the hat is finished, it's exactly the same as all the others.
Thank you very much. Come on.
She knows what suits her. Blue, of course, in all possible shades. I never knew there were so many different shades of blue. This hat I made her for the christening, I think it was, of Prince William. It's very pretty, as you can see. And over here I have the dress. And naturally the dress came first. It's usually a very simple dress, and then in the summer she's got a coat over it of the same material, but it's a little bit floaty, so we call them her floater coats. The hat is mounted on a bandeau like that, which is, Queen Mother calls it her protector, because it covers her little chignon at the back here, gives her a little bit of softness just in the front, and it holds the hat on beautifully. That's her secret, she calls it, that makes the hat stay on very well. Sometimes it happens to be a tiny little bit too tight and she doesn't want to tell me. She has been known to get her little nail scissors and snip inside the ribbon, and then call me in desperation and say it's not working, and I say, oh, you snipped it again, you've been scissor happy, and she laughs.
I always remember her saying, she said, well, unless my page says to me, Your Majesty, you look absolutely wonderful. She said, I know, I look dreadful. So you can imagine always, every time she came down the staircase, just about to go off to do some public thing, there'd be William standing there saying, Your Majesty, you look simply wonderful. Then she'd know. She said, I know, that's all right, I can now go out.
Queen Elizabeth's image was concocted before the war by the couturier Norman Hartnell. But it was the photographer Cecil Beaton who, like a court painter, crystallized it and insinuated it into the public's imagination. This style developed into the image of a gossamer granny that persisted to the end of her life.
I think only Beaton and Snowdon had an intuitive understanding of the kind of reticence or line not to cross to create the magic without suggesting any hint of vulgarity about it. I mean, Parkinson, there was always a degree of glitz about Parkinson. It always edged slightly the wrong way. And Parkinson would do things like that dreadful photograph of Princess Margaret, the Queen, and the Queen Mother, all with these terrible blue shawls that he put round them, satin shawls. It was just simply dreadful and should never have been done, ever.
There's that lovely photograph of the three of them all in royal blue dresses together, and that has been a major factor within the family. It has been a very close relationship indeed. The Queen and Princess Margaret, and both of them with their mother.
Oh, it's lovely.
The royal family is famously passionate about racing. The first horse Queen Elizabeth owned in 1949 was shared with her elder daughter, but she quickly decided she'd rather strike out on her own.
I first got to know her when she trained with my husband at Fairlawn. I remember we said to Princess Margaret, I wonder if they'll share, the two queens, and Princess Margaret said, no, Mummy wouldn't share with anybody.
Do you know that I haven't watched from a pair of binoculars for ages? Look at it, pouring with tears. Oh dear. I always watch on the television. It's the emotion. No, I watch on the television. No, Mummy, you can look into the wind like that. It's like looking at a deer.
Leaving the high-rolling glitz of the flat to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth concentrated on the rural rough and tumble of steeplechasing, with its cosier atmosphere and colourful characters. Of all her trainers, she was closest to the late Peter Cazalet.
Mr. Cazalet was a good trainer, and he was very strict. Great discipline in stables, you know.
She used to call him the Führer because he could be dictatorial about where horses were going to run, what things were going to happen, and he was always very amused by that, but she used to pull his leg in that way. When she came to see the horses in training at my father's home at Fairlawn, she'd go round what are called evening stables. She's then armed with a carrot, which she always fed very professionally at her horses. And my father used to get very nervous because some horses can be quite fractious, and when they see something coming, they're not too worried whether they bite your hand or the carrot.
Oh, well, of course I read Sporting Life. Get my day-to-day news. A little gossip. It's always great fun. Oh, it's one likes to keep in touch.
Good racing weather at Aintree, and more than 250,000 people are here to see the biggest event of the chasing calendar, the Grand National. This year there are 2 royal entries, both owned by the Queen Mother, Devonlock and Matuvu. Here comes the first of the 30 jumps in the 4.5-mile course. They're streaming out. High Guard is down. So's Reverend Prince, Border Luck, and Master Favourite out of the race at the first fence. That's an awful lot of punters out of luck.
I've always loved them, really, ever since I was a little girl. And trouble is, one gets too fond of them sometimes. You know, you hate to see anything happening to them.
Oh, that was merely another down. Jockey Dick Francis is pushing Devonlock ahead inch by inch. Eagle Lodge is beginning to tire, but there's still plenty of power.
There were 250,000 people there. I think 249,999 were all cheering for the Queen Mother.
Devonlock's going strongly at jump 29, and it looks to the crowd as though a royal win's a certainty.
And you could hear this crescendo of cheering building up.
Only 40 yards to go. Devonlock can't move. He slipped. He's down.
I think it was Her Majesty's popularity lost to that Grand National because everyone was cheering for her. The crescendo hit him. My God, what's that? His hindquarters just refused to act. Down he goes on his belly, slides along the ground. All hope of winning the Grand National is gone.
Dick Francis walks off the track in tears, a bitterly disappointed man.
Her Majesty is most philosophical. She said, well, that's racing. And my word, that was racing.
I was thinking the other day, it must be about 80% disappointment. Or more, perhaps. But that makes up, doesn't it, when you do get a winner? I think it's well worth it.
You're in the 2:30 race. What time? 2:30. Yes, sir. And you'll start about 10 to 1.
How far is this?
Just no distance at all.
And I start at 10 to 1. I can go home for my dinner, can't I? How about the other horses?
Oh, they start about 5 to 4.
What, the same day?
Same day, same race.
And I start at 10 to 1?
Yes.
Watch me about 2:45. I'll show you something.
Ever since she first saw them in the 1930s, Queen Elizabeth had a passion for the Crazy Gang, and Bud Flanagan became a personal friend. We went to see the Crazy Gang, she wrote to Osbert Sitwell, and that quite restored me. An evening of a real English music hall audience gave one back a lot of faith in one's own people. They laughed so heartily and so kindly.
Everything amuses her. That's the secret of her life, I think.
She always takes a picnic to the beach hut at Holcombe. And that is it's a most lovely, wide beach. But in fact, it's slightly spoiled now because half is a nudist colony.
Well, then she sends people out to count the nudists. And it's considered quite a joke. Considered very bad taste, but it's quite a joke.
I said, oh, ma'am, do you think they're going to be nudists? She said, oh, yes. There frequently are. And when they catch sight of me, they scutter into the dunes, their dear little white bottoms bobbing like rabbits.
She loves the television, and she's very knowledgeable. She knows all about the programs.
In 20 minutes' time, a train will come through the station, and it will be carrying the person of His Majesty King George VI.
No, King George VI.
Camouflaged, of course.
Excuse me, sir. Is the train camouflaged, or is the king camouflaged?
Adores Dad's Army. She's seen it several times over. And she likes, is it called Allo Allo?
Don't move. What? My name is Michel Dubois. Time is very short. Listen very carefully. I shall say this only once.
I beg your pardon?
I have to say, without wishing to tread on toes, she used to talk about the English rather more than the British, informally. Dear old English, she said. So wonderful.
She's a tremendous P.G. Wodehouse person. I mean, she went the other day to do a P.G. Wodehouse ceremony in London and to unveil a plaque above the house where he used to live.
The master, she calls him. When I was Provost of Eton, she used to come every year. We put on... We did Wodehouse very often. Well, twice we did Wodehouse, I think, or once. We did Pig Hoey. Lord Emsworth. I was Lord Emsworth.
She said, if I die in my sleep, I will surely be found with a seraphic smile on my face, and that will be quite simply because just before I close my eyes, I've been reading about the world of Blandings, or the world of Worcester.
You see, you're the same generation as my mother, and there's something extraordinary about this generation.
Yes.
See, my mother is the same, I think she's about the same age as you, and there's no stopping them.
Absolutely. I mean, when somebody is 20 years older than you, they don't find it tiring. But I've never seen Queen Elizabeth flump into an armchair like I do, when your feet are killing you and your shoes hurt and your ankles are swollen. No, I think she
She very disciplined like that.
Queen Elizabeth at Clarence House or anywhere, or even sitting on a sofa, she's always sitting like that, absolutely ramrod back, because she must have been taught by her governess. Nobody does that. I mean, that is something from an earlier age. But I think it would have kept her going, because always this feeling of correct etiquette and composure and the arrangement of the body.
She's a great disregarder of pain or discomfort. I mean, she would have to have a totally smashed leg or something of that sort ever to give way to it. And when all of us are saying, oh, you can't do that and you must lie up and so on, she ignores it.
The Queen Mother was dining with friends at the Royal Lodge in Windsor when she started to choke.
I remember that day the starter consisted of a whole rainbow trout. Queen Elizabeth attacked her trout with some gusto, and shortly afterwards there was a sort of and it was obvious that a fishbone had lodged in her throat, but she wouldn't have any help. We had rather a nervous time, and luckily Princess Margaret was on hand and insisted that a doctor be called.
She had an emergency operation under general anaesthetic to remove the fishbone. It was the first time in nearly 30 years that ill health made her cancel her public duties.
The second fishbone incident I was rather more intimately connected with, in that I'd actually called the fish responsible. I'd been out fishing in the middle of Caithness, and using a method of filleting which had been taught to me by an old friend, I set about these trout. And conscious of the first fishbone incident, I was pretty careful, at least I thought I was, to make sure there were no bones left in these fillets. And said, oh, actually, this is frightfully good, let's try these. And almost in the second bite, there was a sort of and I thought, oh Lord, I don't believe this. Anyway, she wouldn't hear anything of it and kept saying, oh, no, it's not the fishbone, it's a bit of dried toast.
Completely all right, thank you. He's fine now, he's fine now. Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. It was just a small problem. Now it's completely sorted out. I'm very glad.
But Queen Elizabeth, to this day, always insists that it was a bit of dried toast. My hope was that it was, but I somehow doubt it.
Her belief in doctors is slightly tenuous. She basically believes that health comes from inside and is up to oneself to keep healthy and go on.
An unwavering stoicism sustained her through the painful, tedious indignities of old age. By 1995, the cataracts in her eyes had become unbearable.
If I or somebody else had come into the room, I'd always make a point of saying, oh, good afternoon, ma'am, so that she could recognise the voice and say, oh, Ashley, no, nice to see you. But you knew she couldn't really see you, and that must have been very boring for her.
The Queen Mother finally had her cataract dealt with in the summer of 1995 under local anaesthetic.
I think it changed her life. I remember her saying, this is the first time for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years that I've been able to see the pattern on my breakfast plate.
But there was still another torment to cope with, the relentless pain in her hip.
The only time I ever really heard her talk about it was one evening she said, I'd love a dry martini, rather useful painkiller.
She decided that the hip must be operated on, to the consternation of her medical advisors.
And they quite rightly said, well, nobody in the world has ever had a hip operation at the age of 95, let alone the actual operation. You've only got a 50-50 chance of actually coming round from the anaesthetic. He said, well, I'm not much enjoying life with a bad hip. I want the operation and I'm going to have it. When they did an x-ray, there was nothing really there in terms of a socket, ball and socket. It was a stump, the leg grinding into her hip, and you could almost hear it as she walked, and it must have been agonizing.
After the operation, when I did see her, I would have said almost 20 years had gone off out of her face. Pain had gone from facing.
On the 4th of August 2000, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother celebrated a remarkable event, her 100th birthday. There was a solemn service of thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral, and a more frivolous birthday pageant on Horse Guards Parade. In honour of this special birthday, the Daily Telegraph published 100 photographs of Queen Elizabeth. Hello magazine produced its own unique two-part souvenir, and The Sun gave its readers a voucher for a free glass of gin and tonic.
I do hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been a wonderful evening. And I'll just say, God bless you all, and thank you.
At St. Paul's, in a rare reversal of royal protocol, it was the Queen Mother who led the procession out of the church.
I think her family are enormously important to her, because she's got a great sense of the continuity of the monarchy, which is what she really thinks is important.
Good morning, Your Majesty. Just in a line here, with the little ones in front. We've got a young man behind we can't see, actually. Could you come a bit forward?
There's an old side of the royal family, but I don't think this generation, or even possibly hers, has. But there was some truth in it. They were brought up to think anyone not royal, or where royalty was not thrust upon them through marriage, as being a commoner, period. And that had the rather good effects of dukes and dustmen being treated more or less in the same way, because nobody was in the same circle. It wasn't so much a circle of grandeur, it was a certain sort of mystical circle, and a circle of incarceration, in a way. I think where the line is concerned, you have to realize that that famous royal we is real. It's an allegory. It's not I, it's us, the state. You are a real head of state. And the alternatives, superannuated politicians and so forth, are too horrible to contemplate.
I remember one night after dinner, it was a lovely hot summer's night, and we all walked down the hill to St. George's. It was a beautiful, still night with a lot of candlelight and wonderful atmosphere. Some of us went up into the organ loft. I remember Princess Margaret was there, the Queen was there, we were all there, and listened to the organist playing. It was lovely, this sort of empty chapel with this lovely music. And we all wandered around looking at various things. And I remember walking past the vault where the king is, and so a sort of railing grid outside it. And we stopped, and Queen Elizabeth said, "This is where the king is." And so with a little sort of lovely twinkle said, and I suppose I should be there too. And walked on, and the Queen turned round to me and said, lovely, she didn't mind a bit. To say that, very touching, really. I think she felt sort of rather funny way, sort of almost looking forward to it, being with him again.